December 26th, 1908. Sydney, Australia. A black man's fist connected with a white man's jaw, and the sound echoed around the world. In that moment, Jack Johnson became the most hated man in America. But to understand why that single punch shattered more than bones, why it broke the very foundations of white supremacy, we must go back 30 years earlier to a small house in Galveston, Texas, where a boy was born into a world designed to crush him before he could stand. John Arthur Johnson entered this world on March 31st, 1878, the son of Henry and Tina Johnson. His parents had been enslaved, their bodies once owned like cattle, their children once sold like property. Though slavery had ended 13 years before Jack's birth, freedom was just a word on paper. The reality was Jim Crow, a system so complete, so brutal, that it made slavery look merciful by comparison. In this new America, black people weren't owned anymore. They were simply suffocated. Every breath was monitored, every step regulated, every dream legislated out of existence. The law said a black barber couldn't cut a white woman's hair in Georgia. It said black and white people couldn't boat together in Oklahoma because that would imply social equality. It said that separate water fountains, separate schools, separate bathrooms weren't just legal. They were necessary to preserve civilization itself. Henry Johnson worked the docks of Galveston, his back bent under loads that would break most men. Tina cleaned the houses of white families, scrubbing floors on her knees while her own children waited at home. They lived in a shotgun shack where the wind whistled through the walls and the roof leaked when it rained. This was the American dream for a black family in 1878. Survive today, hope for tomorrow. But Galveston was different from the rest of Texas. The port city was rough, dangerous, and strangely integrated. White, black, Mexican, and Native American workers labored side by side on the docks. In the bars and brothels of the red light district, money mattered more than skin color. It was here, in this chaotic mix of cultures and colors, that young Jack Johnson learned something revolutionary. He didn't have to bow his head. While other black children were taught to step off sidewalks when white people approached, Johnson walked straight ahead. While others were trained to answer, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," with downcast eyes, Johnson looked white men in the face when he spoke. His parents worried. His teachers scolded. The community elders warned that his defiance would get him killed. They were probably right. By the time Johnson was a teenager, he had grown tall and strong, his fists earning respect in the rough neighborhoods of Galveston. He discovered boxing, not in some fancy gymnasium, but in back alleys and makeshift rings where men fought for pocket change and pride. Here was a world where skill mattered more than color, where the hardest punch won regardless of who threw it. Or so it seemed. The truth was darker. Boxing, like everything else in America, was segregated. There was an invisible line called the color barrier that no black fighter could cross. White champions refused to fight black challengers. Promoters wouldn't book mixed matches. Newspapers ignored black fighters entirely, no matter how talented they were. The message was clear. This sport, like this country, was for white men only. Black fighters could beat each other bloody for the scraps, small purses, local recognition, the right to be the best among the excluded. But the real prize, the heavyweight championship of the world, might as well have been on the moon. It wasn't just that no black man had ever held it. The entire system was designed to ensure that no black man ever would. Johnson didn't care about the system. He had been breaking rules his entire life, and this was just another rule to break. While other black fighters accepted their place in the shadows, Johnson trained with the fury of a man possessed. He studied every technique, absorbed every lesson, built his body into a weapon that could destroy any man who stepped in front of it. He had speed that made opponents look like they were moving underwater. He had defensive skills that turned their best punches into glancing blows. Most dangerously of all, he had the confidence of a man who truly believed he was equal to anyone, white or black, rich or poor, champion or challenger. This confidence terrified white America more than any riot, more than any rebellion, more than any army they had ever faced. Because if Jack Johnson could stand as an equal in the boxing ring, what was to stop every other black man from demanding equality everywhere else. But Johnson had something his oppressors feared most: the audacity to believe he was equal to any man. Tommy Burns thought he could run forever. The Canadian heavyweight champion had conquered every white challenger, knocked out every approved opponent, and earned the respect of every boxing authority that mattered. But there was one man he refused to face, one fighter whose very existence threatened to shatter the comfortable lie that white men were naturally superior in the ring. Jack Johnson had been calling him out for 3 years. Not politely, not quietly, but with the relentless fury of a man who knew his destiny was being stolen from him one day at a time. While Burns defended his title in the safety of white-only venues, Johnson was demolishing every fighter they put in front of him. He knocked out former champions, destroyed rising contenders, and fought with a style so beautiful and brutal that even racist newspapers couldn't ignore his brilliance. His defensive mastery made opponents look foolish. His counterpunching was poetry written in pain. His confidence was absolutely maddening to a world that demanded he show humility. The boxing establishment tried everything to keep Johnson away from their precious title. Promoters refused to book him. Managers wouldn't let their fighters face him. Sports writers pretended he didn't exist, focusing instead on lesser white fighters who posed no real threat to the natural order. They created an entire fantasy world where Johnson simply wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't ready for championship-level competition. Johnson understood the game perfectly. If they wouldn't let him fight for the title in America, he would follow the champion wherever he ran. If Burns wanted to hide behind the color barrier, Johnson would chase him across every ocean, through every continent, until the whole world could see who was afraid and who was hungry. The chase began in earnest in 1907. Burns took his title to England, hoping the Atlantic Ocean would be barrier enough. Johnson followed. Burns fled to France, believing European sophistication would protect him from this American embarrassment. Johnson followed. When Burns ran to Australia, literally to the other side of the earth, Johnson boarded a ship and followed him there too. In every city, Johnson's presence was a provocation. He wore expensive suits that cost more than most men earned in a year. He drove automobiles that gleamed in the sunlight. He carried himself like royalty, not like a man who was supposed to step aside when white people approached. Most infuriatingly of all, he smiled. The confident smile of a man who knew exactly how good he was and wasn't ashamed of it. The press called him arrogant, uppity, a threat to civilization itself. They said he was fast with his fists but slow in his mind. They claimed he was lucky, not skilled. They wrote that no black man could possess the heart of a true champion, the courage required when the stakes were highest and the lights burned brightest. Johnson let them write their lies. He knew the truth would reveal itself when the gloves came on and the bell rang. Words were weapons for weak men. He had fists that could shatter jaws and dreams that could reshape the world. By 1908, the pressure had become unbearable. Burns was running out of places to hide. The Australian promoters were offering enormous purses, money too large for even a racist champion to refuse. Boxing fans around the world were demanding the fight. The press, despite their hatred of Johnson, couldn't ignore the story any longer. A black man was chasing the white heavyweight champion across 3 continents, and everyone wanted to see how it would end. Burns finally agreed to fight, but only on his terms. The bout would be held in Sydney on December 26, 1908. The purse would be split heavily in Burns' favor. The fight would go until one man could no longer continue. No time limit, no mercy. Burns believed he could outlast Johnson, break his will through pure endurance and superior heart. He was catastrophically wrong. From the opening bell, Johnson transformed from hunter to destroyer. His jab snapped Burns' head back repeatedly. His defensive movement made the champion look clumsy and desperate. When Burns threw his best combinations, Johnson would slip them easily, then counter with shots that echoed through the stadium like gunfire. By the middle rounds, Burns was bleeding from cuts above both eyes. His face was swollen beyond recognition. Johnson was talking to him between punches, asking if he wanted to quit, suggesting he save himself the embarrassment of being knocked unconscious. The crowd, overwhelmingly white and hostile to Johnson, fell silent as they watched their champion being systematically destroyed. In the 14th round, Johnson landed a perfectly timed uppercut that lifted Burns off his feet. The champion crashed to the canvas, his body broken, his reign ended. Police rushed into the ring to stop the massacre, but it was too late. Jack Johnson had done the impossible. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, the first black man to hold the most coveted title in all of sports. The living proof that white supremacy was a lie built on fear and maintained through violence. The crowd didn't cheer. They sat in stunned silence, watching their entire worldview crumble with each breath Johnson took as the new champion. In that moment, he wasn't just a boxer anymore. He was a revolution with fists, a rebellion that couldn't be stopped by laws or lynchings or social pressure. But revolutions make enemies. And Jack Johnson had just declared war on the most powerful enemy in human history, the belief that white men were born to rule the world. They couldn't beat him with fists, so they decided to destroy him with something far more powerful, the law. Johnson's greatest crime wasn't what he did in the ring. It was how he lived outside it. A black man in 1909 was supposed to shuffle, not stride. He was meant to whisper apologies, not roar with laughter. He should dress in rags and be grateful for scraps, not wear silk suits and demand the finest of everything. But Jack Johnson had never learned these rules, or perhaps he had learned them and chosen to burn them to ashes. He drove a bright red racing automobile through the streets of Chicago at breakneck speeds, his gold teeth flashing as he smiled at the terrified faces of white pedestrians diving out of his way. His diamond-studded watch caught the sunlight like captured stars. His tailored suits cost more than most black families earned in a year. He ate in the finest restaurants, stayed in luxury hotels, and spent money with the careless joy of a man who had earned every dollar by risking his life. White America watched in horror. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. Black success, if it had to exist at all, should come with humility. It should be accompanied by endless gratitude to the white people who had graciously allowed it to happen. It should never, under any circumstances, look like this. A black man living as if he were the equal of any white millionaire, as if his money spent the same, as if his dreams mattered just as much. But Johnson's lifestyle was only the surface wound. The deeper cut, the one that drew the most blood and fury, was his choice in women. He didn't just live like a white man. He loved like one too. In the twisted logic of white supremacy, black men were simultaneously dangerous predators and inferior beings. They were supposedly too violent to be trusted around white women, yet too weak to compete with white men on equal terms. These contradictions didn't matter to the believers. What mattered was the sacred myth at the heart of their entire worldview: white female purity. This wasn't really about protecting women. It was about protecting power. If a white woman could choose a black man over a white man, if she could look past color to see character, strength, and love, then what did that say about the natural superiority white men claimed to possess? If black men could provide better, love deeper, and treat women with more respect, then the entire foundation of racial hierarchy would crumble. Johnson's first wife, Etta Duryea, was a white woman from Brooklyn who fell in love with the champion before he was famous. She saw past the color barrier to the brilliant, confident man beneath. When she married Johnson in 1911, the newspapers didn't report a love story. They described a tragedy, a pure white woman corrupted by a savage predator. The reality was different. Etta wasn't a victim. She was a partner. She traveled with Johnson, managed his business affairs, and defended him against critics with the fierce loyalty of a woman who knew exactly what kind of man she had chosen. But white America couldn't accept this version of events. They needed her to be helpless, pathetic, brainwashed by a monster who had somehow bewitched her into betraying her own race. When Etta took her own life in 1912, crushed by the constant pressure and harassment, the newspapers barely mentioned the role their relentless attacks had played in her death. Instead, they used her suicide as proof that relationships between black men and white women were inherently destructive, doomed by the natural order of things. Johnson's grief was profound, but he refused to let it break him. Within months, he had married again, this time to Lucille Cameron, another white woman who loved him despite knowing the price she would pay. The wedding drove white America to new heights of rage. How dare he? How dare this black man continue to live freely, to love openly, to refuse the shame they demanded he carry? Every aspect of Johnson's life became a battleground. Reporters followed him everywhere, documenting every meal, every purchase, every conversation. They twisted his generosity into arrogance, his confidence into cruelty, his success into evidence of moral corruption. When he tipped waiters generously, they called it showing off. When he bought expensive gifts for his wife, they called it flaunting his undeserved wealth. When he smiled, they said he was mocking white authority. The psychological warfare was constant and brutal. Johnson couldn't walk down a street without being watched, couldn't enter a restaurant without being judged, couldn't show affection to his wife without triggering national outrage. Every moment of his public life was scrutinized for evidence that he didn't deserve the freedom he had claimed. White ministers preached sermons about the danger he represented to Christian civilization. Politicians used his name as a symbol of everything wrong with America. Business owners refused to serve him. Hotels turned him away. Even in victory, he was made to feel like a criminal. But Johnson understood what his enemies understood. This wasn't really about boxing or lifestyle or even marriage. This was about power. His very existence as a successful, confident, unapologetic black man was a challenge to the foundational lie of American society, that white people were naturally superior and black people were naturally inferior. Every time he stepped out a luxury car, he proved that black men could accumulate wealth. Every time he spoke with intelligence and wit, he proved that black men possessed keen minds. Every time a white woman chose to love him, he proved that black men could inspire desire and respect. He was living proof that the hierarchy keeping millions of black Americans in poverty and despair wasn't natural law. It was artificial construct, maintained only through violence and fear. The establishment tried everything to destroy this proof. They attacked his character in newspapers. They banned his fights from being filmed. They pressured businesses to refuse his money. They turned his own success into a weapon against him, using every achievement as evidence of his dangerous ambition. Nothing worked. Johnson kept winning fights, making money, and living freely. He kept smiling that maddening smile, kept wearing those expensive clothes, kept loving those white women who chose him over the white men who claimed to be their natural superiors. If they couldn't break his body, they would break his spirit. The government had found their weapon. Reno, Nevada blazed under the desert sun as America held its collective breath. July 4th, 1910, Independence Day, had become something else entirely. The day white America would reclaim its throne or watch its empire crumble in the dust of a makeshift boxing ring. 18,020 spectators filled every seat, their voices creating a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles. 500 journalists from around the globe scribbled frantically, knowing they were witnessing history, though whether it would be triumph or catastrophe remained to be seen. This wasn't just a boxing match. It was a holy war with gloves, a battle for the soul of racial supremacy itself. James Jackson Jeffries had answered the call. The former heavyweight champion, undefeated in his prime, had been coaxed out of retirement by desperate promoters and the pleading of an entire race. White America needed a savior, and Jeffries was their chosen warrior. 6 feet 2 inches of California granite, built like a machine designed for destruction. The press had crowned him their great white hope before he threw a single punch. Jack London, the famous author whose adventure stories had thrilled millions, captured the moment's importance in words that dripped with racial hatred. It is Jeffries' duty to prove that a white man is king over a black man. London spoke for a nation convinced that natural law demanded white dominance, that God himself had ordained this racial hierarchy, and that Johnson's reign was nothing more than a temporary aberration that needed correcting. In the opposite corner stood Jack Johnson, the man who had shattered their comfortable world. He smiled as he entered the ring, that maddening grin that had infuriated white America for 2 years. Where Jeffries looked grim and determined, Johnson appeared relaxed, almost amused by the hatred surrounding him. He joked with his cornermen, winked at reporters, and carried himself like a man attending a party rather than a public execution. The contrast was deliberate. Johnson understood the psychology of intimidation. While his opponent felt the crushing weight of an entire race's expectations, Johnson fought only for himself. He had no white America to represent, no racial superiority to prove, no mythology to uphold. He was simply the better fighter, and he knew it. When the bell rang, the crowd expected Jeffries to charge forward like an unstoppable force, to overwhelm Johnson with raw power and determination. Instead, they watched their hero stumble into a masterclass in boxing artistry. Johnson's jab found its mark repeatedly, snapping Jeffries' head back with surgical precision. His footwork made the former champion look clumsy and confused. His defensive genius turned Jeffries' best shots into glancing blows that barely ruffled his composure. Round after round, the horrible truth became undeniable. Jeffries wasn't just losing. He was being humiliated. Johnson wasn't even breathing hard while their great white hope gasped for air. The black champion talked between punches, offering advice, asking if Jeffries wanted to quit before things got worse. The crowd's roars of encouragement gradually died into stunned silence. By the 10th round, Jeffries' face was a mask of blood and swelling. His legendary power had been neutralized by Johnson's superior speed and timing. His famous endurance meant nothing against an opponent who hit harder and moved better. The myth of white physical superiority was being demolished one punch at a time, broadcast to a watching world that had believed white dominance was written in the stars. The end came the 15th round. Johnson landed a perfectly timed combination that sent Jeffries crashing to the canvas. The former champion tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him. As the referee counted him out, 18,000 white spectators sat in deathly silence, watching their entire worldview collapse with their fallen hero. Johnson was still the heavyweight champion of the world. Still black, still unbeaten, still smiling that infuriating smile that said he had known this outcome all along. The violence began before the arena had emptied. Across America, white mobs took to the streets, their humiliation transforming into murderous rage. They couldn't hurt Johnson. He was surrounded by police and security, but they could punish every black face they found. In Houston, New York, Philadelphia, and dozens of other cities, white terrorists attacked black neighborhoods with baseball bats, knives, and guns. The death toll mounted quickly. At least 20 people died in the race riots, though that term was itself a lie. These weren't riots. They were massacres, organized campaigns of revenge against black Americans whose only crime was sharing Johnson's skin color. Hundreds more were beaten, their homes burned, their businesses destroyed by mobs that couldn't accept the evidence of their own eyes. Congress moved swiftly to ensure this humiliation could never be repeated. They banned the distribution of fight films across state lines, terrified that moving pictures of Johnson's victory would inspire black Americans everywhere to question their assigned place in society. The visual proof of black excellence was too dangerous to allow. They had tried to beat him in the ring and failed. Now, they would use the one thing that had never failed them, the law. In 1912, the United States government declared war on Jack Johnson. They called it justice. The weapon they chose was the Mann Act, a law passed in 1910 with noble intentions, to combat human trafficking and protect women from forced prostitution. Named the White Slave Traffic Act, it made it a federal crime to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. The law was meant to save innocent victims from genuine predators. But in the hands of prosecutors hungry for Johnson's destruction, the Mann Act became something else entirely. A legal lynching rope, perfectly suited for hanging a black man who had committed the unforgivable sin of living freely in white America. The government's case centered on Belle Schreiber, a white woman from Milwaukee who had worked as a prostitute before becoming involved with Johnson in 1909. For months, federal agents had pressured her, promising immunity if she would testify against the champion, threatening prosecution if she refused. They needed her to say that Johnson had transported her across state lines for prostitution, even though their relationship had ended years earlier and had nothing to do with commercial sex. Bell eventually broke under the relentless pressure. Her testimony painted Johnson as a manipulator who had coerced her into traveling with him for immoral purposes. The prosecutors knew this narrative was fiction. Bell had been a willing adult who chose to travel with Johnson because she enjoyed his company and his money. She had never been forced, never been trafficked, never been the helpless victim the government needed her to be. But truth was irrelevant. The prosecution wasn't seeking justice. They were seeking Johnson's head on a legal platter. The hypocrisy was staggering and deliberate. White millionaires routinely transported their mistresses across state lines without facing federal prosecution. White politicians kept women in apartments in different cities without anyone questioning their morality. White businessmen traveled with female companions who weren't their wives, and the Mann Act slept peacefully in its legal folder. Only Jack Johnson faced the full fury of federal law enforcement for relationships that would have been ignored if he had been born white. The government's message was clear. Black men didn't have the same rights to adult relationships that white men took for granted. The law was a tool to be used against those who threatened the racial order, not a principle to be applied equally. The trial was theater designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Johnson sat before an all-white jury in a Chicago courtroom, knowing that these 12 men saw not an individual accused of a crime, but a symbol of everything they feared about changing America. They looked at him and saw the black man who had beaten their great white hope. They saw the uppity fighter who refused to bow his head. They saw the dangerous example who proved that black men could succeed if given the chance. Justice was never a possibility. This was a public ritual designed to put Johnson back in his place and warn every other black American what happened to those who reached too high. Johnson's defense team argued the obvious, that the government's case was built on lies, that the Mann Act was being twisted beyond recognition, that no crime had actually been committed. They pointed out the selective prosecution, the racial motivation, the manufactured evidence. They might as well have been speaking to statues. The all-white jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. In their minds, the case was simple. A black man had acted as if he were equal to white men, and that equality had to be crushed before it spread. The legal details were just window dressing on a lynching that happened to take place in a courthouse instead of under a tree. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Johnson to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison, a carefully calculated punishment designed to strip him of his citizenship rights while ensuring he would serve the sentence in the notorious Leavenworth Penitentiary. The extra day was pure malice, a judicial middle finger that said the court wasn't even trying to hide its racial motivation. Johnson faced the moment every proud black man in Jim Crow America eventually confronted: submit to the system that demanded his destruction, or fight back knowing the cost would be everything he had built. He chose defiance. While his lawyers filed appeals that everyone knew would fail, Johnson made plans to escape. He wouldn't give white America the satisfaction of watching him march into prison for the crime of living freely. He wouldn't allow them to break his spirit in a federal cage, wouldn't provide them with the spectacle of his submission. In June 1913, while his case wound through the courts, Johnson slipped across the Canadian border and boarded a ship for Europe. In one desperate gamble, he had transformed from America's most famous athlete into America's most wanted fugitive. The heavyweight champion of the world was now a man without a country, carrying a title that had become both his greatest triumph and his heaviest burden. The government had finally found a way to defeat Jack Johnson. They couldn't beat his fists, couldn't break his spirit, couldn't silence his laughter. But they could make him an exile, could force him to choose between his freedom and his homeland, could ensure that his victory in the ring would be remembered as the beginning of his destruction outside it. For 7 years, the greatest heavyweight champion in the world lived as a fugitive, hunted by the country he had once represented. They couldn't defeat Jack Johnson in the ring, so they decided to wear him down year by year, until there was nothing left. Exile is a special kind of death, one that kills the soul while leaving the body breathing. For 7 long years, from 1913 to 1920, Johnson wandered through Europe and South America like a ghost haunting his own life, carrying the heavyweight championship of the world like a crown made of thorns. The newspapers back home painted his exile as a grand adventure, a wealthy athlete living in luxury across glamorous European capitals. They wrote of fine hotels, expensive restaurants, and adoring crowds who appreciated his boxing genius without America's racial hatred. The reality was devastatingly different. Johnson was a man without a home, carrying fame that had become a curse. Every border crossing was a negotiation. Every hotel registration was a gamble. Every public appearance risked violence from white expatriates who had carried their American prejudices across the ocean like contaminated baggage. In London, boxing promoters welcomed his name recognition but insisted he fight only exhibitions against carefully selected opponents who posed no real threat. The British press described him as a novelty act, an exotic attraction from the savage colonies rather than the greatest fighter alive. He was forced to smile through their condescension, to perform gratitude for scraps when he had once commanded the world's attention. France offered temporary refuge, but even Paris, supposedly the most civilized city in Europe, treated him like a dangerous curiosity. French newspapers wondered aloud whether a black man could truly possess the mental capacity for championship-level boxing, or if his success was merely the result of primitive physical advantages. Johnson read these articles in languages he barely understood, but racism needed no translation. The isolation was crushing. He missed his mother's cooking, his friends' laughter, the familiar rhythms of American life. He dreamed of walking down Chicago streets without fear, of visiting his barber, of hearing English spoken with accents that felt like home. Instead, he woke each morning in foreign hotel rooms, surrounded by languages that sounded like mockery and faces that looked at him with curiosity rather than recognition. Belgium dealt him a particularly cruel blow. The colonial power that was systematically murdering millions of Africans in the Congo banned Johnson from presenting boxing exhibitions on their soil. The irony was suffocating. A nation built on black exploitation declaring a black champion too dangerous for public display. Even in Europe, white supremacy knew no boundaries. World War I transformed his exile from difficult to desperate. European nations closed their borders, suspended sporting events, and viewed all foreigners with suspicion. Johnson found himself trapped in a continent tearing itself apart, his American passport offering no protection in a world that had gone mad with violence. The war that consumed millions of white lives also destroyed his ability to earn money in European rings. Desperate for income, he accepted wrestling matches against opponents half his age and twice his size. The great Jack Johnson, who had once commanded the world's respect in boxing rings, now grappled with journeymen in third-rate venues for audiences that came to watch a former champion humiliate himself for money. Each match chipped away another piece of his dignity, another fragment of the confidence that had once made him invincible. South America offered new stages but familiar prejudices. Argentine promoters paid him in pesos that bought less than dollars, housed him in accommodations that wouldn't have been acceptable for white fighters, and advertised his matches as spectacles rather than serious sporting contests. Brazilian crowds cheered his victories, but saw him as an entertainer rather than an artist of violence. The psychological toll accumulated like poison in his bloodstream. Johnson had built his identity on being the best fighter in the world, on proving black excellence in the most public arena possible. Now he was reduced to exhibitions against inferior opponents, his legendary skills wasted on matches that meant nothing to anyone who mattered. The fire that had driven him to chase Tommy Burns across 3 continents began to flicker and dim. He wrote letters home that were never answered, sent money to family members who couldn't write back for fear of federal surveillance. The American government's reach extended far beyond its borders, turning Johnson's exile into a prison without walls. He was free to travel anywhere except the one place he wanted to be, home. The loneliness ate at him like acid. Johnson had always been a social creature, drawing energy from crowds and conversation. Exile forced him into isolation, surrounded by strangers who saw him as a curiosity rather than a man. He spoke to mirrors in empty hotel rooms, practiced his smile for audiences that would never truly appreciate what they were watching. His body began to betray him. The shoulders that had once moved like liquid steel stiffened from years of sleeping in unfamiliar beds. The hands that had once delivered knockout punches ached in the cold European winters. The legs that had carried him to victory after victory grew heavy with the weight of constant travel and emotional exhaustion. Most damaging of all was the gradual erosion of hope. Johnson had fled America, believing his exile would be temporary, that public opinion would shift, that justice would eventually prevail. As years passed without change, as American newspapers continued their attacks, as the government showed no interest in allowing his return, the truth became inescapable. He might die in exile, never again setting foot on the soil that had shaped him. The champion who had once trained with the intensity of a man possessed now struggled to find motivation for basic conditioning. Why prepare for greatness when greatness had been stolen from him? Why maintain the body of a warrior when the war was being fought in courtrooms and newspaper columns thousands of miles away? White supremacy had found the perfect weapon against Jack Johnson. They couldn't break his fists, so they broke his heart. They couldn't defeat his skills, so they attacked his spirit. They couldn't destroy his body, so they poisoned his dreams. By 1915, the effects of exile would become devastatingly clear in a ring in Havana, Cuba. April 5, 1915. The sun beat down mercilessly as Jack Johnson entered the ring for what would be his final stand. Havana, Cuba offered the perfect stage for his destruction. The tropical heat was brutal, soaring past 100 degrees in the afternoon sun. The arena held thousands of spectators who had come to witness either resurrection or execution. Most expected the latter. Johnson was 37 years old, soft from years of exile, his legendary conditioning replaced by the wear of constant travel and emotional exhaustion. Across the ring stood Jess Willard, the latest great white hope. At 6 feet 6 inches and 250 pounds, the Kansas giant possessed the physical tools that white America prayed would be enough. Willard had trained specifically for this moment, spending months in preparation while Johnson struggled to find adequate sparring partners in South American cities that barely understood professional boxing. The contrast was stark. Youth versus age, preparation versus desperation, hope versus the dying embers of greatness. The fight was scheduled for 45 rounds, a marathon designed to test endurance rather than skill. Johnson had once thrived in long battles, his superior conditioning and defensive genius allowing him to wear down stronger opponents. But that was before exile had poisoned his preparation, before years of wrestling matches and exhibitions had dulled his competitive edge. In the opening rounds, glimpses of the old Johnson flickered like candlelight in a hurricane. His jab still found its target with surgical precision. His footwork still made Willard look clumsy and confused. His defensive mastery still turned the giant's power punches into glancing blows that barely disturbed his balance. For a moment, it seemed possible that genius might triumph over circumstance, that skill could overcome the systematic destruction of his prime years. The crowd watched in fascination as Johnson dominated the early exchanges. His speed advantage was obvious, his boxing intelligence overwhelming. Willard swung like a man chopping wood while Johnson moved like water, flowing around attacks and countering with shots that echoed through the arena. In rounds 13 and 14, Johnson landed combinations that would have finished lesser men, his power still capable of rattling even a giant's jaw. But exile had taken its toll in ways that couldn't be masked by skill alone. Johnson's stamina, once limitless, began to fade as the tropical sun climbed higher. His legs, once springs of steel, grew heavy with accumulated fatigue. His breathing, once controlled and rhythmic, became labored and desperate. The fire that had once burned inside him was now just smoldering ash. Willard, prepared for a war of attrition, simply absorbed the punishment and kept coming forward. His strategy was brutally simple: survive Johnson's early brilliance and wait for the inevitable collapse. The giant possessed something Johnson had lost in Exile: the certainty that time was on his side. By the 20th round, the transformation was complete. The legendary Jack Johnson had been replaced by a tired old man wearing his face. His movements became sluggish, his punches lost their snap. His defensive genius couldn't compensate for legs that refused to carry him away from danger. The heat seemed to drain his life force with each passing minute. Willard sensed the shift and pressed his advantage. The punches that Johnson had easily avoided in the early rounds now found their target. The combinations that had bounced harmlessly off his defensive skills now landed with increasing frequency. The crowd, sensing blood, began to roar with anticipation. The end came the 26th round with devastating finality. Willard landed a crushing right hand that caught Johnson flush on the jaw. The blow lifted the former champion off his feet and sent him crashing to the canvas like a fallen tree. Johnson tried to rise, his warrior's heart refusing to accept defeat, but his body had finally surrendered to the cumulative weight of 7 years of persecution. As the referee counted him out, Johnson lay on his back with his arm shielding his eyes from the blinding Cuban sun. The image was heartbreaking in its symbolism. A great man finally broken by forces beyond his control, defeated not by superior skill, but by systematic oppression that had worn him down one day at a time. The popular story, spread by Johnson himself years later, claimed the fight was fixed, that he threw the match in exchange for promises of amnesty and money. Boxing historians have thoroughly debunked this myth. Willard himself dismissed it with bitter humor. If he was going to throw the fight, I wish he'd done it sooner. It was hotter than hell down there. The truth was more tragic than any conspiracy. Johnson's defeat wasn't the result of corruption or cowardice. It was the inevitable conclusion of a campaign designed to destroy him. They couldn't beat him when he was at full strength, so they waited until Exile had done their work for them. They couldn't defeat the champion, so they created conditions that would defeat the man. In that Cuban ring, white supremacy achieved its goal not through superior boxing, but through superior cruelty. They had finally found a way to silence Jack Johnson's laughter. They had their title back, but the price of destroying Jack Johnson would echo through history. Jack Johnson's story didn't end with his defeat. It became a blueprint, both for oppression and for resistance. In 1920, after 7 years of wandering the world like a ghost haunting his own life, Johnson made the hardest decision of his career. He returned to America and surrendered to federal agents at the Mexican border, trading his freedom for the chance to die in the country that had destroyed him. The man who had once been the most famous athlete in the world walked into custody with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally accepted that some battles cannot be won. Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary welcomed him with the same racist brutality that had defined his entire American experience. But even behind bars, Johnson refused to be broken completely. Prison officials, expecting trouble from the notorious champion, discovered instead a model prisoner who read voraciously, mentored younger inmates, and carried himself with the same unshakable dignity that had once infuriated white America. He served nearly a year, every day a reminder of what happened to black men who forgot their place. His release from prison marked the beginning of a different kind of exile, living as a cautionary tale in his own homeland. Johnson's story became required reading for every black athlete who followed, a masterclass in what not to do if you wanted to survive success in white America. Joe Louis learned the lesson perfectly. When the Brown Bomber rose to heavyweight prominence in the 1930s, his handlers crafted a public persona designed to avoid Johnson's fate. Louis had rules that Johnson had never followed. Never gloat over white opponents. Never be photographed alone with white women. Always appear humble and grateful for opportunities. Louis was packaged as the good Negro, Bible-reading, mother-loving, God-fearing, and most importantly, non-threatening to white supremacy. The strategy worked. Lewis became a beloved American hero, his victories celebrated rather than punished. But the price was steep. The complete suppression of his authentic self, the constant performance of subservience, the exhausting burden of representing his entire race through careful self-censorship. Lewis succeeded by accepting the limitations that Johnson had died fighting against. Decades later, another heavyweight champion would explicitly reject the Lewis model and embrace the Johnson legacy. Muhammad Ali saw his own story reflected in Johnson's defiance and explicitly cited the Galveston Giant as a major influence on his life and career. Ali understood that Johnson's greatest victory wasn't defeating Tommy Burns or Jim Jeffries. It was refusing to live on his knees, even when standing up meant losing everything. Ali's own battles with the American government over Vietnam War resistance echoed Johnson's persecution, proving that little had changed in the decades between their peaks. Both men were stripped of their prime years for refusing to submit to systems that demanded their silence. Both paid devastating personal costs for the revolutionary act of living as free black men in America. Johnson's vindication came slowly, carried forward by historians, documentarians, and activists who understood that his story was America's story. The endless struggle between the promise of equality and the reality of systematic oppression. Ken Burns' masterful documentary, Unforgivable Blackness, introduced Johnson's saga to new generations, ensuring that his suffering would not be forgotten or dismissed. The campaign for Johnson's posthumous pardon became a decades-long crusade, supported by lawmakers, celebrities, and ordinary Americans who recognized the profound injustice of his persecution. The effort gained momentum as America slowly confronted its history of weaponizing laws against black citizens who threatened the racial hierarchy. In May 2018, President Donald Trump officially granted Johnson a full posthumous pardon, acknowledging what historians had long known: that Johnson's conviction was a travesty of justice motivated entirely by racial hatred. The pardon was meaningful recognition, but it came too late to matter to the man who had died in 1946, still carrying the weight of a criminal conviction for the crime of loving freely. Johnson's story remains devastatingly relevant in modern America, where the techniques used to destroy him continue to target black Americans who dare to challenge systematic inequity. His persecution established patterns that echo through contemporary struggles for justice. The selective enforcement of laws, the weaponization of legal systems, the systematic destruction of black wealth and opportunity. But Johnson's legacy transcends his persecution. In every black athlete who speaks truth to power, in every fighter who refuses to accept artificial limitations, in every person who chooses dignity over safety, Jack Johnson's flame burns on. His defiance became a template for resistance, his suffering a foundation for progress, his unbroken spirit a reminder that some things are worth losing everything to defend. Jack Johnson dared to live as a free man in a country that would not allow it. For that unforgivable act, he lost everything. But in his defiance, in his refusal to bow, he lit a flame that burns still. His story reminds us that some prices are too high to pay, and some freedoms are too precious to surrender. Jack Johnson's story didn't end with his death in 1946. It lives on every time someone refuses to accept the limitations society tries to place on them. His fight for dignity and equality continues in courtrooms, boxing rings, and communities across America today. If Jack Johnson's courage moved you, if his refusal to bow down inspired you, then his legacy demands action from you. Subscribe to Black Legacy to discover more untold stories of black heroes who paid the ultimate price for freedom. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories they don't want you to know. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that resistance has always come at a cost, but silence costs even more. Comment below with the name of another black pioneer whose story deserves to be told. Your voice matters in keeping these legacies alive. Jack Johnson proved that one person's defiance can shake the foundations of injustice. What will you do with the freedom he helped secure? The choice, like the power, is yours. Don't let his sacrifice be forgotten. Subscribe now. This is Black Legacy, making the heroes the hero they are.